Christian Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents God's Monsters, Vengeful Spirits, Deadly Angels, Hybrid Creatures, and Divine Hitmen of the Bible by Esther Hamori. Narrated by Lisa Larson. Monster Heaven. Every now and then, safari goers make the fatal mistake of forgetting that they're surrounded by wild animals, that no matter how well managed the environment may be, it is filled with wild things, dangerous to their core. The Bible is like that too. When we read these ancient texts, no matter how carefully managed they've been, we are visiting wild and dangerous terrain, and who knows what we'll find there. The biblical world is full of monsters. Uncanny creatures lurk in every direction, from the hybrid monsters surrounding God in heaven to the stunning array of peculiar beings touching down on earth, and from giants in the land of milk and honey to Leviathan swimming beneath the seas. Most have been tamed by time and tradition. The cherubim, menacing winged animal guardians, have become heavenly babies, marketed for feel-good cuteness on greeting cards and framed prints to be hung on a bathroom wall. The seraphim, multi-winged creatures with serpentine bodies and humanoid hands, have become conflated with angels. Angels, meanwhile, have acquired the soft-edged glow of a Hallmark card, even as they are some of the deadliest shapeshifters in a universe teeming with bizarre figures. Other monsters are hidden altogether, masked in translation as natural phenomena, like the demon's pestilence, plague, and the chill, who'd be prime comic book villains, except that they work for the good guy. Who are the monsters skulking through the pages of the Bible? And what do they tell us about their God? Strange and frightening creatures have always surrounded us. We stumble upon them, or they upon us, in legends, histories, travel reports, medical books, philosophical works, theological treatises, and epics from all places and times. Wherever there were forests, there were forest-dwelling monsters. In every wine-dark sea, giant monsters toppled ships. The ancient and medieval worlds were brimming with so many bizarre, dangerous creatures, basilisks, ogres, giants, and all manner of composite beasts, that it's a wonder humanity made it to the Renaissance. Every culture has its monster lore, and the world behind the Bible is no exception. If anything, it seems especially overrun with monsters. The Bible is a collection of texts from ancient Southwest Asia, formerly called the ancient Near East, mapping roughly onto the region known today as the Middle East. And in literature from this region, as in Greek mythology, there are monsters spilling out the windows. From Canaan to Mesopotamia, people wrote spectacular epics and poetic masterpieces about their gods, including the monstrous figures who served them, fought them, and ruled among them. Being divine, you see, was not in conflict with being a monster. The best-known Babylonian creation story features the great goddess Tiamat, who's also the monstrous sea, complete with a tail. Marduk, who slays Tiamat and creates the world out of her body, is a gigantic, fire-breathing god with 4 eyes and 4 enormous ears. Sometimes the monsters are divine, and the gods are monstrous. It can be more obvious who the monsters are when you're looking at someone else's mythology. When it comes to the Bible, though, even a vague sense of familiarity can fog up the picture. The Bible is made up of diverse texts that were written by people trying to make sense of the world around them, including the heavens and the earth and all they contained. It has an incredible history, texts from a world long gone, preserved and passed down for millennia, made new with each generation's reading. But this is also its great pitfall. These texts have been compiled and canonized, interpreted and misinterpreted, cherished and wielded. PG versions of stories are mistaken for what's in the texts themselves and mask what's right before our eyes. The Bible has been domesticated, along with the eerie creatures within. Familiar images like seraphim winging and singing, and peaceful divine messengers ascending and descending might register to the modern reader as what is in the Bible. But beware. In those pages, monsters play freely, wreaking havoc and bringing death and destruction to their divinely chosen targets. What makes a monster? I teach a course called Monster Heaven, and on the first day of class, I ask students to name their favorite monsters. A few sea monsters are named. A sci-fi fan says Cthulhu. A rabbinical student names Leviathan. And a student from Vermont calls out Champ, which I learn is the monster of Lake Champlain. But then one person mentions the Wendigo, who's been devouring swaths of the general public for centuries across North America. And another adds the Islamic Ifrit, a malicious genie made of fire. A young man breaks into an exuberant rendition of Supper Time from Little Shop of Horrors, the solo of the giant singing man-eating alien plant Audrey 2. What do these monstrous beings have in common? That part of the conversation is more complex. Monsters have no single defining trait. Many are easily recognized by the blood dripping from their befanged jaws or the decaying flesh falling from their faces. Bodily anomalies are common, each type uniquely suited to the spread of its own brand of fear: the sharp and pointy, the huge and hairy, the grotesque and gooey. But even with the dazzling variety of anomalies in the monster compendium, they don't all advertise their monstrosity with some physical aberration. Next to your more obvious monsters, beside the gigantic thrashing sea monsters and radioactive killer robots, there stand little girls with ribbons in their hair. Sometimes the creepiest monsters are the ones we thought were innocent, but turn out to be very, very bad. Nor do monsters all share a place in the world. There are the naturalistic, like Jaws or Bigfoot, the supernatural, like succubi and incubi, and the unnatural, like the Yakumama, a giant river monster at the mouth of the Amazon that devours any creature unwise enough to dip a toe anywhere within sucking distance. Physically terrifying or perfectly innocent in appearance, naturalistic, unnatural, or supernatural, monsters share no single defining characteristic. There are nice, succinct definitions out there, but they all fall short because it turns out you can't pin a monster down. There is, however, a certain family resemblance, a collection of features from which monsters draw in diverse and overlapping combinations, even across cultures, time periods, and genres. Heads up, every one of these features will come back to haunt us in the chapters ahead. Giant size is a common family trait, from the kraken to the Mokele Mbembe, a Congolese cousin of the Loch Ness Monster, and from Mesopotamian Marduk to Hellboy. Superhuman or supernatural strength and power is another common family trait, even among the emphatically non-supersized, like Chucky, Child's Play 1988, and other killer dolls. Ruby, Meg, and Supernatural's other young demon women throw the strapping heroes across the room whenever they please. Lethal superpowers, like the basilisk's literal death stare, are always a good show of monstrosity. Perhaps the most common monstrous trait is physical hybridity, the mixing of two or more species. Bizarre composite creatures fill the pages of works both ancient and modern, spanning genres from myth, centaurs, satyrs, the chimera, to tales of terror, from the highbrow to the low, the creations of Dr. Moreau and Sharktopus, 2010. There are other varieties of hybridity too, like being both living and dead. These are your entry-level monsters, like vampires, zombies, and every reanimated corpse since Frankenstein's creature. Then there's the combination of animate and inanimate, like the lethal car in Christine, 1983. Yes, these too will resurface as we explore the biblical monster world. Shapeshifting and realm crossing are also common family traits. Some monsters take different forms at different times, like werewolves and Pennywise of Stephen King's It. Other monsters cross between realms. A dead person who stays contentedly dead is no threat, but the moment such a soul crosses back over to walk the earth, a monster is born. Spirits might be innocuous, as long as they remain on some cosmic home turf. But problems arise when they cross realms to interfere with human beings, as they all too often do. The flip side of these traits of hybrid and multiple forms is the amorphous or formless monster, like chaos in Ovid's Metamorphoses, described as a raw, unordered mass, and the invisible evil of The Haunting, 1963. Many stories of ghosts and evil spirits revolve around formless threats. Some of these are also shapeshifters. The looming threat of John Carpenter's The Fog, 1980, would be anticlimactic if the fog didn't shift into the form of zombie pirates who slaughter townspeople, which is wicked, even if the townspeople sort of deserve it. Then there are the monsters that would seem natural, if only they showed up alone. One bird? Fine. A horde of birds attacking en masse? Monstrous. Like in this classic example, The Birds, 1963. The creep factor doesn't come just from the countless creatures' activity, but from their unnatural collective will. These juicy category violations, from grotesque bodily anomalies, giant size, and supernatural strength, to forms that are composite, shifting, realm-crossing, amorphous, or countlessly multiplied, are the most common traits from which members of the monster family draw. No monster has all of these traits. All monsters have some. As with features of monster physiology, there's a common monster geography. Monsters usually dwell outside of human society, lurking in the liminal spaces and the places beyond, the depths of the forest, the heart of the sea, encountering people either when they break into human territory or when people dare to enter those dangerous realms. A recent Onion headline reads, "Report, leading cause of death still venturing beyond the pines." Monster life flourishes in the elsewhere places, mountaintops and mysterious islands, cemeteries and sewers, the strange old house at the end of the road. In An American Werewolf in London, 1981, an old man in the gloomy northern pub warns Jack and David, "Stay on the road. Keep clear of the moors." They don't. If only the monsters would stay in the elsewhere and beyond. The problem is their propensity to break into this realm. Like the creature of Stranger Things, who comes from the upside down but breaks into this dimension, monsters are forever pressing against the boundaries, threatening to breach our world. And how many elsewhere and beyond places the Bible has. All kinds of monstrous figures peer out, each kind manifesting its own combination of the classic monster family traits. In the heavens above, huge winged creatures with confusing assortments of body parts threaten interlopers. This is also the home turf of an array of brutal, realm-crossing divine hitmen, each having the terrible combination of lethal superpowers and the ability to cross all natural boundaries to use them, sometimes shapeshifting along the way. Manipulative spirits walk about in the heavens, but come sweeping through the earth like wind to pursue their human prey. On earth, The forbidding, closed-off room at the far end of the divine house is guarded by fierce composite creatures. An unfamiliar land is filled with giants who are the hybrid descendants of natural and supernatural species. In the depths of the sea, the gigantic and indescribable Leviathan swims with his multi-headed kin. These creatures, the massive and the formless, crossing realms and shifting shapes with too many wings and too many heads, occupy every part of the biblical universe, their very existence pointing to the God and creator of their world. When we see them, we are confronted with him. About that him, I use masculine pronouns for God in this book. This is because I'm writing about the God who appears as a character in the ancient anthology of texts we call the Bible, in which he's portrayed as male. This is a matter of literary accuracy, not a theological claim. For those who closely connect that character to a God they believe in today, the gendering of the ancient portrayal of God may be one of many things worth grappling with. The 5th century theologian and philosopher Augustine explained that creatures contrary to nature are called monsters, Latin monstra, because they demonstrate a monstrando, something. And for Augustine, it was something wondrous. Monsters of the Bible can indeed demonstrate something about the nature of the biblical God. But be prepared. God's nature isn't always so benevolent. In fact, this God may be the monster of monsters. The biblical God and his entourage of monsters. As the biblical monster population comes into focus, one chilling element stands out. The most dangerous of these monsters are in God's employ. They're not his opponents, they're his entourage. He's the one who sends hybrid creatures on the attack, who commands forces of demons and dispatches vengeful spirits, who repeatedly orchestrates the mass slaughter of civilians by his divine hitmen, angelic and otherwise. God is surrounded by bizarre, monstrous creatures, and they commit remarkably violent acts on his command. In fact, every single type of divine being that is shown acting in the service of God in the Bible threatens, injures, tortures, or kills on his behalf. Some are exclusively violent, like the destroyer. Others have multifaceted roles, like angels, who appear perfectly docile when performing one aspect of their job, but create mass carnage when doing another. Each type of divine being in God's service has its own profile, its characteristic set of job responsibilities, and every one of them includes doing the boss's dirty work. This is the heavenly retinue we'll meet in the first part of this book. Terrifying, serpentine seraphim flap around God's throne and burn a witness with glowing coals. Hybrid cherubim serve as monstrous bouncers and bodyguards. We'll see God dispatch the adversary, his enhanced interrogation expert, to torture and kill at his behest. We'll watch as God deploys stealthy spirits as psyop specialists to manipulate and gaslight his targets. And as devastating as the demons he sicks on the population are, they don't hold a candle to those most lethal shape-shifting soldiers, God's angels, who execute thousands in the blink of an eye when they're not attacking on a more intimate level. Throughout the Jewish and Christian Bibles, from Genesis through Revelation, God commands an entourage of monsters. In the second part of the book, we'll meet the monsters of the sea, earth, and underworld. They don't work for God, but they have plenty to teach us about him. The activities of God's monstrous inner circle show us his character from one angle. The intense, heated dynamics between God and the monsters outside of his entourage show us another. Monsters can be lots of fun. I can grab the remote at any moment and see that I'm not alone in this opinion. But biblical monsters can also present some problems that those on the screen don't. So why choose to look at the biblical monsters and wrestle with such texts? For me, the answer is personal. A few months after my older brother killed himself, I had a dream in which I was trying to remember which one of us had died. I couldn't figure it out, couldn't wrap my mind around it. As years went by and I ticked off each milestone, now I'm older than he ever was. Now I've lived longer with him dead than alive. Now I'm twice as old as he ever was. His death became less the focus and more the lens through which I see the world. His death, and after it, my sense of a world spinning out off its axis without order, propelled me into a long period of religious exploration, turning over a variety of ideas before finding my way back home to Judaism, the tradition I grew up in. Along the way, I tried focusing on the many biblical passages of comfort and hope, but taken alone, they fell short. Maybe that's why they're not alone. The Bible is rich with comfort, but also chock full of macabre stories. And with their recognition of a troubled reality, they offer something that the safer, prettier texts can't. Hope is all well and good, but acknowledgement of the grim has a comfort all its own. These monsters that I find so compelling demonstrate something about their world. Monsters have meaning. Monsters raise questions. Monsters make us think. What are we to make of the menacing monsters of the Bible? Is there room for wonder? Or, seeing that these monsters don't stay put in the elsewhere and beyond, but break dreadfully into this realm, as monsters do, might they demonstrate something else about the God who deploys them, or about the Bible itself? The Bible has been domesticated, muzzling its monsters. Sometimes our translations carefully sidestep the brutality of these creatures in the original texts. Later writers cleaned things up a bit, developing some characters in more palatable ways. A troop of hybrid beasties became a serene angelic choir, and the adversary was safely removed to hell. God, too, has been tamed. But this does a disservice to the original portrayals in the Bible. The ancient authors understood something about the world. These portraits of God's monsters aren't primitive theological drawings over which we can, with relief, superimpose the neater pictures of later theology, where good and evil are clearly distinguished. The heavens are filled with God's goodness. All harm is attributed to another hand, and everyone colors inside the lines. These ancient thinkers recognized that the world can be a sinister and dangerous place. They saw all around themselves the reality of chaos, pain, grief, violence, and fear. They wrote about monsters because they, like us, knew a world that was filled with monsters of all kinds. These aren't crude constructions, but poignant expressions of the dangers and afflictions of life. Far from telling themselves that the presence of God assured their well-being, the Bible's ancient writers had a sense that on the edges of their world, just beyond their own realm, all sorts of monstrous creatures were lurking. Let's meet them now, and the complicated, some might even say monstrous, God who puts them to use. Part 1. God's Entourage. 1. Seraphim. On a 110-degree night in July 1945, the USS Indianapolis was struck by torpedoes and sank in the Philippine Sea. Among 1,195 crew members, some 900 made it through the initial disaster, only to end up struggling for their lives in the water. Many died of their injuries, dehydration, and drowning. And then there were the mass shark attacks. Corporal Edgar Harrell described what it was like to see the fins coming toward him in the water, to see a shipmate alive one day, and recognize what remained of his corpse the next. To hear blood-curdling screams cut through the sounds of the wind and sea. By the time rescue came, there were only 316 survivors. 72 years later, when the wreckage was found, Harold said the trauma lived on. The crew member's ordeal, almost inconceivable in its layered horrors, seems to follow the contours of a story in the book of Numbers in the Bible. The Israelites narrowly escaped Pharaoh's army, only to find themselves dying in the desert, trudging through the scorching heat without water, stricken with disease, with no help in sight. Many are lost. Numbers chapters 11 through 20. Those who remain lament that it would have been better to die in Egypt, where they had been enslaved. And then come the snakes. Poisonous snakes swarm among them, biting and killing a huge number. Chapter 21, verses 4 through 9. From how far away could they see the snakes slithering toward them? Did they witness family and friends attacked and dying? Did they hear screams? It's easy to blithely bypass the horror of biblical stories. Too often, we chalk it up to being a necessary element of some kind of morality tale. But other great literature of the ancient world doesn't sacrifice meaningful engagement with human drama for the sake of a neat moral. Why expect less of the Bible? Whatever the Bible means to you as a reader, let's begin with the assumption that this literature too is richly textured, filled with the ancient writers' poignant reflections on the human condition. The story of the mass snake attack in the desert is horrifying. The people would be terrified, traumatized. What does a story this appalling reveal of the writer's thoughts about their God? Wait, you might think, why are we talking about snakes? It's because these particular snakes are sent by God to attack and kill God's people. And these snakes have a special name: seraphim. What's in a name? The best-known seraphim of the Bible are the heavenly creatures in the prophet Isaiah's vision of God seated on his throne, surrounded by winged seraphim who cry, "Holy, holy, holy." Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. They're often mistaken for angels, but originally they weren't angels at all. Not only that, they're not even the main type of seraphim in the Bible. They're a small part of a network of related creatures, all called seraphim. Like many famous figures, they have some skeletons in the closet. The word seraphim appears in most English Bibles only in Isaiah's vision. In the original Hebrew, though, seraphim appear in several other texts too, and each time they're a type of deadly serpent. Translators of the Bible handle this in a variety of ways, but rarely by using the word seraphim as they do in Isaiah chapter 6. This is a glaring example of a principle that my students would tell you I never tire of talking about. All translation is interpretation. In this case, translators decide that Isaiah's heavenly seraphim are unrelated to the deadly seraphim serpents in other texts, and so they leave the Hebrew word seraphim untranslated only in Isaiah chapter 6. Readers then have the impression that these creatures are unconnected. The total disconnect between the celestial and terrestrial seraphim isn't a matter of what's actually in the Bible, but of what we've been taught about the Bible. The earthly seraphim aren't your everyday serpents. In 2 of the 4 passages mentioning them, these snakes have, wait for it, wings. And those 2 passages? Also in Isaiah. Isaiah's heavenly seraphim, which he describes as flying around God's throne, are clearly related to the earthly creatures he calls flying seraphim, which are explicitly a type of snake. The 2 stories outside of Isaiah mentioning earthly seraphim, including the desert snake attack, refer to them in Hebrew as seraphim snakes, using the 2 nouns together. No wings are mentioned, So these seem to represent the naturalistic end of the seraphim spectrum, though not entirely natural, as we'll soon discuss. Recalling that monsters can be naturalistic, unnatural, or supernatural, we see the full range represented in the seraphim family. It's like the spectrum within the scary canine genre, from Cujo, naturalistic but not entirely natural, to werewolves, unnatural hybrid creatures on Earth, to hellhounds, supernatural monsters residing in another realm. One thing all of the seraphim have in common is their propensity for a certain form of violence. We see it in every text where they appear, and even in their name. The Hebrew word saraph, singular of seraphim, suggests burning. That's why the King James Version, not wanting to associate deadly reptiles with heavenly beings, called the seraphim snakes fiery serpents. Some modern Bibles stick with this traditional interpretation. Other translations try to make sense of seraphim snakes by lopping off the interesting bit and just calling them serpents. But the Hebrew saraph comes from an active, transitive verbal root meaning to burn something. Seraphim aren't passively fiery, but actively burners. And I'll give you one guess what they burn. On Earth, they strike people with burning venom. In heaven, with burning coal. And in the Bible's two main stories about seraphim, one taking place on Earth, one in heaven, they do their people burning in God's employ. The heavenly and earthly seraphim share a cluster of other traits too, but we'll have to wait to see them. For now, let's tread carefully into the first scene. You may want to watch your step along the way. We begin with the naturalistic end of the seraphim spectrum, the disaster movie sequence in which God annihilates his people in the desert using an army of seraphim snakes. On Earth. Seraphim snakes headline one show in the Bible. It's memorable, and not just to the modern monster fan. Later biblical writers allude to it too, and the clearer the picture becomes, both of that story and of the allusions that follow, the more disturbing it gets. Snakes on a plane. This isn't the first time the people following Moses through the desert lament that it would have been better for them to die in Egypt. The previous time, God replied with a diatribe in which he vowed to make them wander for 40 years, including multiple versions of "Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness." Numbers chapter 14, verses 26 through 35. So the people wander on, desperate for water, many perishing along the way. They grieve for their lives. They have no food other than manna, which we later find out is not all it's cracked up to be. They cry out, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" God responds essentially, "Oh yeah? I'll show you death in the wilderness." He then sends seraphim snakes to bite the people, many of whom die. Stricken with fear and venom, the people quickly repent and ask Moses to prevail upon God to get rid of the snakes. God responds, but not by getting rid of the snakes. Instead, he tells Moses to make a seraph. Moses will turn out conveniently to have some bronze on hand and pop it on a pole, explaining that anyone lying around bitten and dying will be able to look up at it and live. Chapter 21, verses 4 through 9. God has just performed mass execution by snake. Some people are healed at the end of the story, but for many, this divine help comes too late. God offers a way to heal those not yet dead from their snake bites, and everyone lives happily ever after, except for all of the people who just got killed, and their families, and the people who just saw their fellow wanderers killed in a mass poisonous snake attack. What sparked this lethal act? The people complained, sure, but the appropriate response to that isn't usually mass slaughter. Perhaps it was what they were complaining about. The people lamented that they were dying in the wilderness, and to be fair, they were. The common defense of God's actions, that the people lacked faith or gratitude, doesn't actually do much in service of God's reputation. This isn't a capital offense. It might provoke a ruler's indignation, though. God lashes out like an oversensitive dictator. If the people lack gratitude, they have good cause. The broader story of the Israelites' wanderings is traditionally spun as if the wilderness was terrible and dangerous, but God protected them. But in this story, it's God who made the wilderness terrible and dangerous for the people. The desert would have been harsh enough without God sicking his attack snakes on the ailing wanderers. One of my earliest memories is of attending a school movie night at the age of 6, sitting on a blanket on the floor of the gym, terrified out of my mind. We watched Lost in the Desert, 1969, possibly not the most judicious choice for the event. There's a single scorpion in the film, as I recall all too vividly, and it appears of its own volition, as non-biblical bugs generally do. The horror in our current story surpasses this. The people lost in the desert are killed when their deity intentionally sends a horde of poisonous creatures to attack them. This divine assault is nothing short of terrifying. The snakes bear only some responsibility here. They're venomous, and God has sent them precisely for this reason. The mob boss who sends killers out to do a job for him is no less responsible for the outcome than those who work under him. This is not God's finest hour. But the seraphim snakes are also monstrous in their own right. God's anger management issues aside, these frightening creatures act en masse to kill an untold number of people. The coordinated snake attack is like a prototype for the birds, where ordinary creatures appear alarmingly and lethally as an organized group. This isn't just a post-Hitchcockian reading. It's pivotal to the plot that the mass attack is unnatural, happening only because God deploys the army of snakes with their burning venom to accomplish his goal. In stories featuring the mass attack trope, creatures are often endowed with intelligence and will. When God sends the seraphim snakes, they don't scatter. They go straight for the kill. Maybe they've been bestowed with intelligence by their mad scientist creator, like the sharks of Deep Blue Sea, 1999. Even if they're only as aware as trained attack dogs, that's strangely aware for a horde of snakes, and plainly horrifying. In light of these events, it's startling that God's next move is to offer healing, at least to those not dead yet, and thus the story is resolved. But what sort of resolution is that? Kiss the ring. After orchestrating the mass snake attack, God has Moses fashion a bronze serpent. This is explicitly synonymous with a seraph. Make a seraph, God says, and so Moses made a bronze serpent. Numbers chapter 21, verses 8 and 9. God instructs Moses to create an image of the very monster he'd sent to attack the people, and mount it on a pole so that those dying of snake bites could look up at it and be healed. For some Christian readers, the end of this story might call to mind a comparison made centuries later between the bronze serpent on a pole and Jesus at crucifixion. John chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. When a writer refers to an older story, knowing that story helps us understand what the later writer has in mind, but not what the earlier writer intended. Faulkner's allusion to Absalom informs our understanding of Faulkner, but not the ancient story of Absalom. However a Christian reader interprets the New Testament comparison, we need to reckon with what goes down in the Numbers passage itself. The New Testament uses an image from Numbers, but what's the symbolism Numbers is using? Why would a bronze replica of a snake cure its bite? As it happens, the poisonous snake was a common symbol, and this story reflects a known use of it for protection and healing. The origin of the protective symbol of a venomous snake is the Egyptian uraeus, the image of a rearing cobra ready to strike, as on King Tut's famous striped death mask. Sometimes these Egyptian uraeus serpents were winged. Pharaohs wore the rearing cobra image for the protection it gave by spitting fire on their enemies. For this reason, one Egyptian term for the uraeus was flame. Like the Bible's seraphim snakes, the uraeus, sometimes winged, sometimes not, burns those it bites. The uraeus wasn't only associated with pharaohs, who were considered semi-divine. Deities in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan were also portrayed with the protective serpent image. By the time the Moses story was written, regional gods had a long history of keeping company with poisonous snakes that were part protector, part avenger. The uraeus was also used for magical protection from snake bites. In Egypt, a serpent amulet might be placed on a mummy to ward off attacks of underworld snakes, while the living wore snake images to fend off the more usual variety. This is called sympathetic magic, the use of an image to affect the thing it represents. Sympathetic magic was used in ancient Israel, too. There are several biblical examples of it, like when God strikes the Philistines with a plague of mice. The Philistines make 5 golden mice and find relief from their plagues. 1 Samuel chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. As in the story of the bronze serpent, the creature feature animal onslaught is resolved through creation of a metal figurine of the creature featured. Sympathetic magic was familiar to biblical writers, as was the image of the uraeus, which appears in various forms in ancient Israel and throughout the wider region known as the Levant. The magical use of the uraeus, a symbol of a burner snake associated with divine power, in order to heal snake bites, is perfectly at home in the Bible. What complicates matters is how God uses this image in the story. Returning to the initial question, if the bronze serpent is meant to resolve things, what kind of resolution is that? The raising of the bronze seraph is often interpreted as an act of divine mercy. But after orchestrating the deadly mass snake attack, might God be the one in need of forgiveness? This offer of healing might save those writhing in pain but still hanging on. But does it redeem the God who sent the seraph snakes in the first place? The uraeus was a symbol of protection, and that's how God uses it. But this is protection in the mafia sense. These are near-fatal injuries that he's inflicted on the wanderers and is now offering to heal, for a price. Incensed at the people's insubordination, the Godfather sends his heavies to do his dirty work. After the people are satisfactorily beaten down, he extorts protection. "Pay homage to me," he says, "and I will protect you from the deadly assault of those I sent to kill you." Those who are willing to kiss the ring, to physically show respect to this symbol of Dawn Almighty's power, will live. The people who capitulate will get protection from the boss's goons. As far as we know, the seraphim snakes are still there when God makes the people this offer they can't refuse. This isn't usually how we want our stories to end. In any context other than the Bible, it's unlikely that we would consider this ending redemptive. When the villain poisons Indy in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, 1984, and then offers him the antidote for a price, we recognize that the bad guy is still the bad guy. This whole story is full of protection in all the wrong ways. Remember that snakes were associated with divine power because they were thought to protect gods by spitting venom on the divine ruler's enemies. Unfortunately for the Israelites, this is exactly what happens in the first part of our story. When God sees the people as his foes, he sends venomous snakes to kill them. In the face of defiance, he uses seraphim snakes to protect his sovereignty and perhaps his honor. In the second part of the story, he uses the bronze seraph to offer the dying survivors a chance for protection from his own entourage. It didn't have to be this way. In fact, within the literature of Israel's Mesopotamian neighbors, another possibility emerges for how a deity might relate to poisonous snakes swarming among his people. Among the tablets recording the military campaigns of the 7th century BCE Assyrian king Esarhaddon, a scary snake encounter is described. The king reports an arduous journey through the desert, where he stepped repeatedly on two-headed snakes and yellow snakes spreading wings. He gives credit to his God for his own survival and for that of his people. The great Lord Marduk came to my rescue. He revived my troops. What Marduk did not do was send the snakes in the first place. In general, the Bible takes a dim view of foreign gods. But as the God of the Israelites was preparing to unleash his army of venomous snakes to annihilate his people, maybe just this once, he could have pondered, what would Marduk do? After these events in the book of Numbers, we never witness another encounter with the deadly seraphim snakes of the desert. But there are 3 additional passing references to them, each time in the context of a verbal threat against those who might dare to oppose God. Live and let die. The first of these is in a speech Moses makes to the Israelites. He reminds the people of the great snake attack in the desert, referencing it as a threat to keep them on the straight and narrow. To the reader's good fortune, Moses' speech also gives us some new information, the inside scoop about God's motivations. Moses begins his speech by exhorting the people to keep God's commandments so that they may live. Not so that they may live long, or so that they may live well, but merely so that they may live. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 1. Readers today may prefer a softer view, but no survivor of God's snake attack would misunderstand. Run afoul of this deity, and he might end you. Moses goes on to remind the people how God led them around the wilderness for 40 years in order to afflict them. Yep, that's literally what the Hebrew word means, and to test whether they would follow his commands. Chapter 8, verses 2 through 3. Among the afflictions, God starved them and then gave them strange food. Moses emphasizes the manna's strangeness. As another story explains, the very name manna comes from the question, what is that? Exodus chapter 16, verses 15 and 31. His blunt recap isn't the comforting tale we often hear, that God guided his people through the desert and provided miraculous food when they were starving. Nope. God led them around the wilderness, starved them, and then gave them weird food, all explicitly in order to afflict them. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 16. I remember the dismay and concern on my young child's face the first time we gave him a taste of baby-friendly strawberry puree. He looked both aghast at the unfamiliar flavor and confused and hurt that we would betray him this way. This is roughly how Bible sanitizing traditions make the manna story theologically palatable. That the food was good, but unfamiliar, and the spiritually immature Israelites failed to appreciate it. But that's not what happens in the Bible. Everything, from the wilderness wandering and starvation right down to the manna itself, is all part of God's intentionally harming his people. If we recall that the people's lament about starvation and strange food was what sparked the mass snake attack in the first place, it's beginning to look an awful lot like they had good reason to lament. As Moses wraps up his reminders of Israel's afflictions at the hands of God, he issues a warning. Watch yourself, lest you neglect the commandments and forget the God who led you around in the great and terrible wilderness with seraph snake and scorpion. Chapter 8, verse 15. Otherwise, Moses warns, God will destroy you Israelites just like he destroys other nations who don't obey him. Chapter 8, verses 19 through 20. This threatening reminder of the seraphim snakes, bookended by blunt reminders of the divinely orchestrated travails that led to the snake attack in the first place, reads like a TV gangster cracking his knuckles to remind you of the last time he beat the daylights out of you. Moses cautions God's people, "You'd better not forget the God who afflicted you and then sent snakes to attack you when you lamented about it. Obey God so that you may live. Otherwise, you won't." Stage directions. Hits lead pipe against palm. Beyond the full story of God's snake attack in the desert, and then Moses' threatening reminder of it, 2 references to desert seraphim appear in the poetry of Isaiah. These lines add a twist. These buggers can fly. Don't say I didn't warn you. One of Isaiah's references to flying seraphim snakes reads like a poetic version of Moses' speech, reminding the disobedient Israelites what could befall them in the desert. In this oracle, presented as God's own words through the prophet, Isaiah is warning Israel not to seek military support from Egypt because it would demonstrate lack of trust in God. Moreover, in order to carry payment to Egypt, they would have to make it through the dangerous desert. Isaiah introduces this warning as an oracle about the beasts of the Negev, and the final deadly beast he names is our old friend. In pursuit of the military alliance that would offend God, the Israelites would need to pass through a land of distress and anguish, from where come lion and lioness, viper and flying seraph. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 6. A reminder that should stop them cold. It's like God is saying, "Remember those seraphim serpents? I can do that again." Like Moses' menacing nod toward the seraphim snakes, Isaiah's also comes with the warning that God will destroy the Israelites if they don't follow his commandments. He begins by threatening that God will besiege Jerusalem and leave the people lying in the dust. Chapter 29, verses 2 through 4. Then immediately after the ominous reminder of the seraphim snakes, Isaiah accuses the Israelites of being rebellious and unwilling to listen to God. Chapter 30, verses 8 through 9. God's aggressive response to being ignored should be familiar by now. God has already committed mass slaughter by poisonous serpent, even as he keeps these seraphim snakes in his arsenal, reminding the people what very bad things can happen to them in the desert.